Greetings and welcome to this Huntington Learning Center webinar, Grades, Courses, Test Scores, What They Mean for College Admissions. Tonight's event features best-selling author Jeff Selingo. I'm Michael Hackmer, I'll be your moderator for today's event, and on behalf of Huntington Learning Center, I want to say thank you so much. We know that there's a lot of stuff going on day in and day out, and we really appreciate you making some time to join us for this event. So a few things about Huntington Learning Center before we introduce Jeff. So Huntington's been around for almost 50 years and is a leading tutoring and test prep organization that serves students in grades K through 12. What I really love about Huntington, there's three great differentiators. First of all the programs are taught by highly trained and certified tutors, and the training team has won lots of awards over the years for how well they train all their personnel and staff, and I think that's really, really important. The second is accreditation. Huntington is accredited by Middle States Association of Colleges and Schools. And the reason why this is important is because this is the same accrediting body that if your child goes through their academic career and receives degrees and certifications, a lot of schools will be accredited by Middle States. And third, and I think probably most important, at least in my opinion, is the fact that Huntington really uses this targeted, individualized learning approach, building out these targeted, personalized programs to help students improve in areas that they really would like to. I really think that that's very important because while every student has similar struggles, whether it's in math or test taking or studying, the problems really can be very unique, right, to a specific individual. And so we really want to focus in on what your strengths and weaknesses are and identify those so that we can really get to the root of the problems and make sure that your student grows and performs better. And the results really do speak for themselves. In just about 3 months on average, Huntington students see an increase of 2.2 grade levels in reading and in math. And when we think about college admissions, test taking, SAT, ACT prep, on average, you're looking at about 229 points on the SAT and 5.4 points on the ACT. So definitely very significant. And then of course, when you're looking at scholarships, one of the other thing about Huntington is we do a lot of work with our students, and they've had on average about $71,000 in scholarship offers. And I think over the last year, that total came out to be about 187 million. So definitely very significant. Now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Jeff Selingo. We've had Jeff on other webinars, and we really appreciate the partnership and him joining us for these events. Jeff is a really well-known best-selling author and a journalist. He's authored 3 books on higher education, including 2 New York Times bestsellers. So he's written Who Gets It and Why, where he spent a year going through the college admissions process, and it's named one of the most 100 notable books of 2020 by the New York Times. Jeff's also a contributor, contributes to The Atlantic, The Post, Times, Wall Street Journal, and we're really, really thrilled to have Jeff with us. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Jeff. Jeff, take it away.
Thank you, and it's great to have everybody here again this evening. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about how the night is going to play out. I'm going to start by talking a little bit more about the high school transcript, what's important, what you should be looking out for as you prepare for the college search. My assumption tonight is that people are already in high school, but you may be before high school tonight joining us. It's slightly different depending on whether you're a sophomore, junior, or senior, but I'll try to make this as broad as I can, and then if you have a specific question, we'll try to get to as many of them at the end of the night tonight. Then I'm going to be joined by Matt McClendon, who is at the University of Alabama in admissions and enrollment, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the University of Alabama and how these things play out that we're talking about tonight play out there. And then after Matt, we're going to be talking a little bit more, a deeper dive on test scores. It's ranking season, as I call it. If you've been paying any attention to the Wall Street Journal or the U.S. News and World Report, which came out with its rankings this week, we'll talk a little bit about how to use the rankings in your college search. And then we'll talk a little bit about trends in college admissions for this year, just a few slides on that, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So I want to start with the transcript, because you may hear, if you're in the admissions process, whenever you go to a campus tour, you're probably going to hear that we practice holistic admissions. And this is the idea that most colleges and universities that are selective in some way don't necessarily have strict cutoffs for SAT and ACT scores, as well as GPAs. Many of them consider things that go beyond just test scores and GPA. And so that's why they ask you to submit essays, recommendations from teachers. They also look at your extracurricular activities. And that's what holistic admissions means. It is looking at the whole person, not just a single measure, particularly around grades and test scores. Now, every school practices holistic admissions differently. What they put their attention to differs by school. You should always ask them kind of what it means to them, what does matter the most. I will tell you that probably for many schools, it seems like they're trying to explain the secret formula to Coke, because it is a formula, it's a black box. There is not an exact formula to say, well, this is worth 20%, this is worth 40%, et cetera. So it is a holistic process, but what matters first in this mix of quantitative and qualitative points from you are these three things: the course selection, the grades, and the test scores. These are the three most important things to most colleges and universities. Again, many of them are going to think slightly differently about holistic admissions, but as you can see on the next slide, this survey that NACAC takes every year of college admissions officers. So this comes from the National Association of College Admissions Counselors. They do a survey every year about what's most important according to college admissions officers. We're going to talk about test scores separately later on, but as you can see, basically high school grades and college prep courses, total high school grades and all courses, the strength of the high school curriculum really outweigh a lot of other factors, including positive character attributes, essays, students' interest in attending, counselor recommendations, and teacher recommendations, right? 77% of respondents consider it, say it's considerably important, the high school grades and college prep courses, grades overall, 75%, and 64% for the strength of the high school curriculum, as you can see. Now, this, as I said, comes from a survey that NACAC puts out. And as I tell students and families often, the best way to think about this is in terms of the importance of grades and courses, is that if everyone is on a starting line, say you're running a race around a track, you all start at the same point. Just your transcript and your grades, the courses you take and the grades are going to get you 60% of the way in some places to that finish line. That's how important they are when you think about the entire package of the admissions application that you're sending to colleges and universities. So what are they looking for? If this is the most important thing, what are they looking for within those transcripts? Next slide here. So this comes from the College Board. Again, everyone's going to be slightly different in terms of what they really care about. But for the most part, what they're looking for is 4 years in many cases. Sometimes some colleges will allow fewer years of some of these main courses, but they're looking for English, that you've taken English every year. They're looking for the math courses that you've taken from algebra through calculus in some cases, biology, earth or physical science, chemistry or physics, looking for history, both US history as well as global geography and economics. And they're also looking for a foreign language. Now, some colleges will look for more than 2 years of a language. Others will look for 2 years. But as you're going through the search, this is something to pay attention to in terms of what they're looking for in terms of high school classes. This is something that's hard to change once you're a senior in high school. So if you're on this call tonight and you're in your first or second year of high school, and you're starting to think about college, start to look on the websites and the admissions websites of the colleges and universities that you're considering to see what they recommend in terms of courses. And what they're really looking for here is not only in the types of courses, but they're looking for, did you challenge yourself? So for example, they might only require 2 years of a foreign language, but if you took 4 years or you're taking multiple foreign languages at the same time, that's seen as challenging yourself to an admissions officer on the other side. Excuse me. In math, you also see calculus. We're going to be talking a little bit with Matt about that later at the University of Alabama. But a lot of colleges and universities will look at things like pre-calculus, or they might look at a more advanced calculus, again, depending on how selective the university is. The more selective the university, the higher their expectations are among the college courses, the high school courses that you have taken. The second thing that they're going to be looking for, and we'll stay on this slide for a second, is they're going to be looking for grades in these courses. And what they really want to know is, what they really are going to be looking for is steady as you go in terms of grades. They don't like grades that are all over the place in terms of spiky, going up, going down. They definitely do not like a downward trend in grades. Often they will be okay with an upward trend if you had a tough transition to high school and say your first year grades weren't as strong as you wanted them to be. Some colleges don't even look at first year grades, so it's the sophomore, junior grades in particular, that are critically important, but they're also going to look at senior grades as well. But again, what you're really trying to look for is consistency throughout your courses. I often get asked, is it better to take a honors course and get a lower grade, or an easier course and get a higher grade? The answer you will get oftentimes from an admissions officer is both, right? Take an honors course and get a higher grade in that. But again, they're looking for the fact that you challenged yourself, and the more selective the university, the more that they expect the challenge. Now, you're seeing here, obviously, the main courses. You're not seeing things like art and music and other courses that you might take in high school. They are going to be looking at those courses, as you saw from that previous slide. But the other thing many schools end up doing is recalculating the GPA. So if your GPA is based on the entirety of all the courses you're taking, including art and music, for example, they are going to most likely, some colleges are most likely to recalculate the GPA for those courses. The other thing is they're going to be looking, if you've declared a major and they've asked you to declare a major, especially if you're applying to a capacity controlled major, so a thing like computer science, for example, or engineering or nursing, where there are way many more applicants than there are spots. They're going to be looking specifically for how you do in certain courses, in science courses and math courses in particular. Next slide. Now, you may ask, well, there's a lot of high schools in the country, right? 25,000 plus US high schools alone. You all know, because you probably know students at many different high schools, that grades and courses vary. So you might ask, well, how do they compare, especially since courses might have different names, for example. So context matters here, right? So as you can just see from this map, which is showing mean test scores that are given in standardized tests throughout the country in different districts, you can see kind of grades are all over the place. And that's what's most important to the admissions officer on the other side of the desk, is they're really looking at the context that you're in. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about this in a minute when we talk about some of the options that they have, some of the materials that they have to look at your high school. But in particular, they're going to ask, what is available to this student at this school, and how are their grades in that context? So context is really important. They're not trying to compare 25,000 different high schools, because they know that grades and courses vary, but within your high school, they're really trying to understand what is available to you. Did you take advantage of those, and how are you doing in those courses, particularly around grades? Next slide. Now, one of the things that's happening right now, of course, is that grade inflation is on the rise, and there is a concern at colleges and universities. This shows you some of the most common grades now, the percentage of common grades, and as you can see, 21% have a 3.5, 23% have a 3.75, 17% 4.0. So the most common grades in high school are essentially a 3.5 and above. And so it's really hard as a result for colleges to differentiate students not only between schools when everybody has a 3.5, a 3.75, or a 4.0, but it also makes it hard to differentiate between students within a school. So as we can move forward here, the question is, so how do admissions officers evaluate courses and grades from different high schools? And there's three ways in particular Again, every college is different in terms of how they evaluate applicants, but overall and generally, three ways that they evaluate courses and grades. And first is what's called a high school profile. This is just a sample high school profile. They all differ, but you should ask your own high school to get their profile so you could understand what it might look like. Again, this is a sample, but what this goes along with your application that is going to colleges and universities. So if they have a question on what is the grade distribution, for example, or what courses are available to this high school student, so that when they're looking at your transcript, they could get a sense of, okay, this student maxed out in math and science, we think, based on their transcript, but let's go over to the high school profile to see if there were other courses they could have taken and maybe decided not to take. And they try to figure out, like, okay, are you not maxing out then what you can take? And again, they're also going to look at your grades. How do your grades compare to everybody else in the community? What other things are available to you? Test scores. How do your test scores compare? Now, college admissions officers might know your high school as well because they may have come to your high school. If you're at a high school where a lot of college reps come through for visits, I highly recommend going to those to try to find out not only more about the college or university you might be considering, but to get to know the admissions officer as well, because it's very common that the admission officer coming to your school, to your high school, to visit and explain what is happening at that college is also might be the same person who might be reviewing your application as part of a larger committee. Doesn't always happen, but that is usually their territory and they might be reviewing that application. The other thing that's going to be happening from the high school is that many colleges and universities have a lot of data on high school students that have come through that college. So, many high schools send a large number of students to particular colleges every year. Those colleges have data on how those students from that high school perform. So some colleges are using that data in admissions. In other words, they know that a 3.5 at this high school equals a 3.4 at college or a 3.6 at college because they've had enough students come through the system over the years that they know how the high school grade from that particular high school translates into a grade at that particular college. And so they may end up using that data in the admissions process. The other thing that they're going to be using is what's called the landscape tool. Now, not every college uses this, but this is a product that the College Board offers to colleges and universities, and it offers data about the high school that is not necessarily on that high school profile, and it offers neighborhood information as well. So it's going to tell you how the test scores compare at this high school to how the students' test scores compare to others at that high school, as well as other high schools in the area. It's going to give you more data on the high school that's included in the high school profile. It's also going to give you a lot of data around the neighborhood around that high school. How many students go to college? What's the median family income? And the reason this is important to an admissions officer is that they don't know a lot about every high school in the US. It gives them that context. Okay, what kind of community is this? How many opportunities does this student, for example, have to participate in activities or sports outside the classroom? It gives them a little bit more of that context as they're looking at that application. And then the third thing they're looking at is test scores. Now, we're going to be talking a little bit later about test scores in particular, particularly around test optionals test scores. But what this shows is that how much test scores have a predictive value. This comes from the ACT. And what you see here is that students who had a 4.0 GPA in high school and took the ACT, you could see what their first year GPA at college was. And so students who scored higher on the ACT had a higher first year GPA. In some cases, it spanned from anywhere from a 3.0 for those who scored lower on the ACT, all the way up to a 4.0 if they scored higher on the ACT, up to a 35. And what this shows to college admissions officers is that the test score does have some predictive value in determining whether students can do the work in college. A lot of the work in admissions is not only about letting students in, but they really want to know, are these students going to be a good fit? Are they going to stay in college, particularly at this college, and are they going to graduate? And one thing, and again, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, is that the test score offers another piece of evidence in addition to the high school grades about whether the student is going to be able to succeed at this institution. And as you can see here, especially with students who had a 4.0, we talked about grade inflation earlier, there's not a lot of differences between those students in their applications because their transcript is showing that they have a 4.0, but if they also have a test score, if they have a 4.0, for example, and maybe they have a 26 on the ACT, the colleges then are able to say, oh, well, maybe their GPA here is going to be a little bit lower, or a lot lower in some cases, and that will lead to a discussion in terms of the committee, in terms of whether to admit that student or not. So with that, I am really excited to introduce Matt McClendon, who is the Associate Vice President and Executive Director of Enrollment Management at the University of Alabama. I've known Matt for quite some time. He was previously at Georgia Tech, the Georgia Institute of Technology, known as Georgia Tech, and has been at Alabama for quite some time now. And actually, I had a chance to visit with him in Alabama a couple of weeks ago. So it's great to have you here, Matt, with us.
Great to be here, Jeff.
So Matt, I have a bunch of questions for you to talk a little bit about how this all plays out in the admissions process. As I said in the introductory slides here, it's often said that the high school transcript is the most critical part of the application. What is the University of Alabama looking for in a transcript? So when you're talking to students about what they should do in high school, especially for those on the call tonight that may have more time, right? Maybe they're sophomores or juniors, and they have more time in their high school career. What can they do? What should they do when they think about their transcript?
Yeah, well, and again, Jeff, it's great to be here. So I think the first thing that's important to kind of provide a framework for here is that you talked about sort of the differences that college admissions offices have. And I think each admissions office will kind of do admissions in a different way. So when you think about the University of Alabama, we are a big place. We get about anywhere between 57,000 and 59,000 applications per year. And we generally have the capacity to enroll a pretty large class, anywhere from about 7,800 to just over 8,000. And because of that volume, we operate on a model that initially does some automatic checks against different criteria that we believe are important and indicative for success. And then depending upon where you fall in those different criteria, may or may not drive additional review. So our overall admissions decisions are really based on three key areas. This is your test score, if you provide it, and I know we'll talk about test scores in a second. Sort of an internal scoring and rubric that we have on the quality of the contents of the application, our own application, and then really your high school GPA. So when you think about our GPA at the University of Alabama, you hit the nail on the head. Everybody really has minimum requirements that need to be met on the GPA, and ours are very similar to what you showed before. I won't read them all off, but 4 units of English, 3 units of math, etc. But really the next thing that we are looking for is we are looking at that overall high school GPA, and we're taking the highest GPA that we see on the transcript. And really that's the reason for that is because in the modeling that we do on the back end and looking at which students are the most successful, really the high school GPA, the high school performance is what I call the anchor of a student's performance, and not only from first to second year, but and beyond. So, for example, if our data shows that a student is generally falling within our middle 50% range, which is around 3.5 to 4.2 or higher, they've done a good job on their application, they're hitting some of the other factors that are important to us, and they provide a test score again that's within the range that we see for successful students. Generally speaking, they're going to be admissible. Now, every case varies. I often tell students I don't make an admission decision on the spot. We try to, we really need to look at the entirety of the file. But when we have to dive in the transcript, I'm really looking at a couple of things. The first thing I'm looking for, and you alluded to this, is I think it's really important to look at the trend line. If we're seeing a trend line going down on a student's application or a student's transcript, if we're seeing problems, especially as they get into later and more difficult courses, and that's combined with an overall lower GPA, which again is our anchor, that student probably is going to have trouble being admitted. The other component, for the students that we, take a further look at is going to look at those core courses, because we find that if the overall core GPA, which we calculate on some of the applications, if they're not hitting the points in English or math, that's really going to be a challenge for that student as they go to enroll if they're decided to be admit. So there's a lot of risk factors that we have to take advantage of or look at, excuse me. The other thing that I would say is that's really important to us, and we have a section on our website, is extenuating circumstances. I've often looked at transcripts and you'll see a good freshman year, a good sophomore year, and something has happened in the junior year. And if the student has provided some explanation as to what happened, family emergency, sickness, whatever, that gives some context to why the transcript is looking where it looks. And we try to tell students to be as honest as they can on the application. It's confidential. We're obviously not going to share that. But if there's no context behind why we're seeing a trend one way or the other, we're just kind of left to assume that the student has been having trouble academically and academically only.
So Matt, I know you're not taking a deep dive on every transcript, but when you do, how do you balance kind of the course work or the challenge, what you see as the challenge of the course versus the grade? How do you balance those two things? Because it's a question I get all the time is like, again, as I said earlier, do you take the easier course and get the better grade, or get the better grade in the easier course?
So I think there's a philosophical and a practical answer, if I can give you both. Yeah. I think the practical answer is, I think it's going to depend on the college or university that you're looking to apply. Okay. And again, I think that for students who are applying to very selective institutions, and as you mentioned, I've worked at one of those before, that transcript is probably going to get a fair amount of scrutiny versus where you may be applying where there maybe is not as selective. And so I think, for example, at the University of Alabama, again, we look at the highest GPA that a student has on the transcript. Well, if you're kind of on the cusp, again, towards that middle 50% range, knowing that we're looking at the overall high school GPA, you may make a different decision about a tougher course based on applying to us. But you may make a different decision if you're applying to, a school that can't admit as many as we do. My philosophical take on this is, I think you need to take the harder course. I think for students, just as my own advice, that the ability to challenge yourself and build resiliency in high school is going to translate well for you in the courses that you're going to take in college. But I do think it comes down again to sort of a practical decision about looking at the schools that you're going to be applying to.
Okay, man, I wanted to specifically ask about math. You were talking about units earlier. Calculus is a question I get often. How important is calculus, especially if you're in kind of a STEM field, engineering, things like that? Like, how important is calculus on the transcript, especially as we know, I only think about like 50% of American high schools even offer it.
Yeah. I mean, that's one challenge, in and of itself. First of all, for just kind of admissions purposes to the University of Alabama, again, we're for sort of the minimum requirements looking for those 3 units of math, and that's Algebra 1, Algebra 2, and then you can either take geometry, calculus, or trigonometry. So, and then any other math outside of that. I think where calculus really takes importance and shape that I have seen at this institution is when you get to advising, especially if you are in our business school or you're in the College of Engineering. Now, we have a philosophy here to admit to the university. So that allows a student to pick the major that they want to go to. And I think that's just an important caveat for us. And I'm proud of that, again, because we have a large freshman class and have a lot of capacity. But when you talk to, for example, conversations I've had with engineering advisors, their motto is, you can't overshoot your math. I mean, there really is not a situation where taking less math in high school to the point that you can is not going to benefit you. Now, for example, when our business school students and our engineering students, when they sit down, they're pretty much told this is where you are in math based on placement test, and this is what you're going to have to accomplish if you want to be a part of this major. And some of them persist and do well, but I think the other part about math that I have heard from the advisors is the better that students can apply themselves in math and the more math that they try to have, not just at the high school level, but also at the college level, we see evidence of that benefiting them in both retaining and graduation, because it's critical thinking skills, it's analysis skills, and it's problem solving skills, all of which you're going to need regardless of your major.
Yeah. So Matt, as I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of sophomores and juniors on this call. Is there something you would recommend to them in terms of what they can do now? I mean, you're still kind of early in the school year,
Sure.
even for juniors, so that they don't have any regrets when they're applying. And by the way, that goes beyond just the transcript.
Yeah. Again, I'll sort of lean on the frame here of practical and philosophical. I think the practical would be that, if you're in your freshman and sophomore years, you need to begin to take, those courses seriously. I think I shared with you when I was, when we met, when you came to campus, that my dad was in college admissions, so it's sort of a family business for me. And I remember him very distinctly sort of sitting me down freshman year and saying, look, the clock starts now. You have to begin to really pay attention to this. And these are the things that colleges are going to look for. So I certainly think taking it seriously. But in terms of the philosophical, how do you avoid regret? When I go to college, our events, when I meet with prospective students, I generally ask them a singular question to begin with. And I ask them, what's important to you? Mm-hmm. And I'm surprised often that many have some very strong answers, but I'm also equally surprised that many students really haven't thought of it that way. And what I generally encourage prospective students to do is to begin to have a framework of which you're going to look at different colleges based on the things that are important to you. And there's no wrong answer for what's important. I think each person is going to approach that differently. But I sometimes see students struggle with that very fundamental question about what they're looking for and using that as a framework for how they're going to look at colleges and potentially making an errant college choice because they haven't really thought about that frame of what's important to them.
You mentioned test scores earlier. Can you talk to me a little bit about the role of test scores at the University of Alabama?
Sure, yeah. So as of right now, we are a test optional institution. We are currently under a multi-year pilot, which is going to conclude this year, and we're going to make a decision about whether or not to use tests going forward. But as of right now, we're a test optional institution. And about half of our students right now apply as test optional, and the other half provide a test score. And I would say generally for the University of Alabama, the test serve really is a good confirmation about what we're seeing within the GPA. It's not necessarily something that's completely going to torpedo somebody's application, but for those that elect to have their score shown, we're really looking at seeing, one, is that falling within a range where a student might be a risk for retention? And if it is, that's probably going to necessitate us looking a little deeper, as I mentioned in the transcript, looking for some of those trend lines that I mentioned, looking for some of the things that the student has done. Does it show grit? Does it show tenacity? Does it show involvement? And so it's one piece of a bigger puzzle. But I will say that, we see in our data that, students generally, as they have a higher test score, represent less of a risk of retention, or less of a risk of stopping out.
And so then is the advice is to take the test and then try to figure out if you're going to submit it, and if it's a good score, probably submit it because it's going to add to bolster your case more than anything, it sounds like.
For us, yeah. And I know we'll probably talk about scholarships in a second.
Yeah, and that's actually my next question.
Yeah.
In some cases, at some places, it matters for helping with scholarships, correct?
It does, it does. And the way that we're set up at the University of Alabama is there's really sort of three branches to the scholarship puzzle. We have our automatic scholarships, which are based on a test score and a high school GPA. And we have maintained those over the years because we've heard from families that the transparency of those awards is very beneficial in the process. You have a certain test score, you have a certain GPA, you know that money is going to be guaranteed. But in the test optional environment that we're in, we also have a competitive scholarship, which looks a little bit broader at students' application, what they've done from a leadership perspective, what they've gotten for academic honors. And we do have some cases where a student with an automatic scholarship will get more funds based on what we see in their application. And we have a January 10th deadline on that for students to be considered. The third branch of the tree is student need, and that generally is more confined to the students from Alabama who fall into what's known as our Alabama Advantage program, which gives funds for students who are Pell eligible.
Okay. I just have a couple more questions
Sure.
for you, Matt. How about the rest of the application file? Like what matters in the rest of the file, especially around activities? What are you really looking for?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I think we're looking for a couple of different things. I think the first is we want to see, when you think about honors, honors are important. We see that again in the data that those students who've gotten either club honors or national honors or state honors, those tend to be the students that represent, again, a lower stop out risk. And, you know, all honors are good, but certainly for a student who has got something beyond just their high school, that's a good marker. The other is leadership, and we have a section in our website that details leadership. I think you noticed when you visited our campus, it's a very vibrant place. We have a lot of clubs and organizations, a strong Greek life, and those, in order to function, are going to have people who take on leadership roles. And so we look at that. But we also look at things like volunteer activities, which are important, as well as students, what they've done work-wise. We have a section that details work and whether or not a student has worked a good part of their high school career, which we see in some of the high schools and more rural areas that we have in Alabama, where work is a big component of the students' lives. And so those are really the many different avenues. But the biggest thing is we want to try to make sure that a student is going to contribute, because we really value an active and vibrant social life, or campus life.
So I want to talk a little bit about out-of-state students, because actually when I took the tour at Alabama the day I was visiting you, we had students from Virginia and students from Georgia and other places. We know that a lot of students are applying to public universities and outside of their home state. How do you think about out-of-state students at the University of Alabama? Because one of the concerns I hear from counselors and parents and students is, it's hard to get into our in-state flagship. It's also hard to get into some out-of-state flagships as well. And we know that many out-of-state flagships have been kind of inundated with applications over the last couple of years. And some people have been deferred and some people have been denied. And I think people are trying to figure out, like, okay, I don't live there, so I don't get that boost from being an in-state student. So how do you think about out-of-state students?
So there's a couple of different things. I think the first, and this is just, an important caveat to share with your listeners, and this is really indicative of many public flagship institutions, and you kind of alluded to it, is the necessity and need to take care of the resident population. And so, that is really kind of the first and foremost. But I think we have, and are very beneficial, about 60% of our students come from outside the state of Alabama. And I think, kind of the advice and counsel that I would give to students who are looking at other flagships, if they're worried about the admissions component, is we generally kind of tend to see students who are flocking to similar type schools. So when we look at our cross application data, when we look at data from the clearinghouse, generally a lot of the students that are applying to us are also applying to a lot of large, typically Southeastern Conference schools. There's some variation in that just because of the number of applications. But generally speaking, I would say if you're looking at a school like Alabama, chances are you're probably looking at a school like South Carolina or Tennessee or Mississippi or LSU. And I think the strategy would be to really look at some of the components that you've looked at here. What are their minimum requirements? What is sort of the middle range of their GPA and test scores? What do they offer in terms of overall campus life? But for our out-of-state population, I think they bring a good vibrancy to our student life. And I think it's an important component of our enrollment mix. Again, we do have to support, the state of Alabama. But I think for students looking at schools, I would kind of encourage them to look at a wide range of flagships, because they're going to have different admissions criteria. They're going to have different size of class that they can take. And candidly, they're going to have different student experiences. And that's why I encourage them to visit, us folks to visit.
Yeah. Well, so speaking of visit, and then we'll wrap up here,
Yeah.
is, I talk to a lot of parents whose kids are really into the search process and others who aren't as much, right? And so, as you said, visiting is a big, differentiator when you get students on campus, but it's also a big differentiator for students, right? To try to understand what they like, what they don't like. How can parents encourage their students who may be more spectators to the process? How can you get them more involved in it and more excited about it?
Yeah, that's a good one. I struggle with that sometimes too, myself, when I go up to different students, and some are more vocal than others, and some it takes a little bit to draw out of the process. I think the first, thing that's important to acknowledge, especially for parents, is that, this is, at times can be a tough process. I mean, this is a fun time of life, I'm sure, but it's also at times can be a stressful one. The college admissions process can be a stressful one. And I think just acknowledging that and acknowledging that there may be some reluctance is a good first step. I think the other thing that's really important is, one, to apply the framework that I mentioned before about really trying to find out for individuals what's important to them, important to the student. And that may take some time, but then beginning to use that framework for the college admissions process. The other thing that I would say to parents that's really important is to try to find ways in areas where current students who here are on campus can connect with your child. And for example, when we visit, we bring students along. When we do events out in the country, we usually bring students from that area to try to do our best to connect. And because they're not always going to talk to an administrator like me, they're probably going to want to talk to another student. And I would look for that or try to push for that when you visit the college.
Yeah, Matt, some great advice there. Anything else I didn't ask about?
No, but I am legally required to give you one roll tide before I go, so I have to say that. Every webinar I do, I have to say roll tide. So
yeah, I will tell folks on the call, if you go to the University of Alabama, it's a great tour, by the way. I love it. You get to go on a bus, so a lot less walking than many campuses. I love it, and you will get welcomed by one of the most beautiful welcome centers, where there is this very cool roll tide room. That if you don't visit there on a football Saturday and you want to get the experience, it's a pretty immersive experience. So Matt, really appreciate you joining us today, and I appreciate your time tonight.
All right, thank you. See you soon.
Stay safe.
Bye.
It was great to have Matt with us from the University of Alabama. So before we move into some questions, I want to talk a little bit more about testing. Matt referenced it. They are in the last year of a test. A pilot test around test optional. Many other colleges were in similar pilots, and they have decided to reinstate the test, including places like the University of Texas at Austin, many of the Ivy Leagues as well. And what I think is going to happen over the next couple of years, again, because we have students on the call this evening from different grades, is that I think the current atmosphere that we're in, where you have some schools that are test optional, some schools that are test optional but are likely to go back, and some schools that require the test. I do think that the test optional bucket will probably remain the biggest of those three buckets, requiring a test, not requiring any scores at all, which is a very small bucket, but test optional being that biggest bucket. But what does that mean? What does test optional really mean? As you heard Matt say, they do look at scores, especially in the context of of the high school record. And what I always encourage students to do when they ask me, well, what should we do about test scores, is number one, take the test. In many places there's school day testing, whether that's with the ACT or the SAT, but having a score gives you options. It allows you to decide where you are in terms of the score. And you will see from this chart that comes from Compass Education Group is that students, particularly at these very selected places where most of these have been test optional, you can see that in 2021, 2022, that the admit rate was actually higher in most places for those students who had a test score. At some places, it was almost 1.5 times higher. Some places nearly 2 times higher, and some places more than 2 times higher if they had a score. And this is particularly true, by the way, by major. So what this doesn't show, this is overall, but if these schools, and most of them don't release this, but some of them have showed me their internal data, is that if you are applying, for example, in a STEM field, so science, technology, engineering, or math, so whether you're applying to like engineering or computer science, if you're applying to a business program, that those students in particular, 90+% in some cases are applying with a test score, where if you're English or humanities or social sciences, it may be a little bit lower in terms of applying for a test score with a test score. So if you're applying again in STEM or business and you don't apply with a test score, you might be put at a disadvantage. Again, it's something to ask during the college search, but the key here is if you have a test score in hand, you could have a strategy to say, I'm going to apply to this school with it or not this school with it. You might be applying to 10 or 12 schools. In some schools, you might apply with it. In some schools, you won't apply with it. But in the next slide, as Matt said, and this is just an example that comes from Utah State University, but many colleges and universities do exactly what Matt talked about, is they have automatic and very transparent charts like this that you can find online for those schools that offer scholarships automatically based on the SAT or the ACT. Some of these are for resident students, as this is. Some of them are for non-residential students, but you could kind of do a comparison here, look at what are the possibilities of getting different levels of scholarships. So even if you have decide not to include your test score for admissions, you might want to include it as part of the financial aid offer. Again, you want to look at the scholarship requirements for different colleges and universities. For these automatic scholarships, you have to have a test score sometimes with your application. Again, it's something to look for depending on what school that you are applying to. But having that test score gives you options. In terms of deciding not only whether to submit it for admissions, but it gives you options in terms of gaining access to scholarships that you otherwise wouldn't have. So we have about 5 minutes or so left before we open it up to some questions that are being asked. And I want to zoom out to 2 other issues that come up frequently when I'm talking to parents. And one of them is the rankings. As you know, we're kind of in rankings season right now. The US News and World Report rankings came out earlier this week on Tuesday. A couple of weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal rankings came out. The Princeton Review rankings came out. And people always ask me, how should I use these rankings? So in the next slide, you'll see this is the for last year's overall ranking criteria for US News and World Report. And what I recommend people to do, if you're going to look at the rankings, and I think the rankings are useful to try to figure out, are there other schools around schools that I'm considering or that I like that are near them in the rankings? And maybe I don't know that much about those schools, but I want to find out more about them. So the rankings to me are good are helpful in terms of increasing your relevancy or your understanding of other schools that are near them in the rankings. But the important thing to understand is, well, why does this school rank in the top 50 in this ranking and it's number 200 in this other ranking, is to always look at this, the methodology. And as you can see, in the U.S. News and World Report, the biggest weight on their scale when it comes to the rankings is actually what's called the peer assessment. And this is why it's important to know. So the peer assessment at U.S. News is a survey that college presidents and admissions deans at other colleges fill out, and they ask them to assess these other colleges on the list. Now, some of these, there's been research done on this, that some of these people filling out the survey, they might spend a couple of minutes. They often don't know that much about the other college. Sometimes they ding every other college because they're competitors to them. But at the end of the day, what's important to know here is that 20% of the score is based on this assessment. It's not based on other things that might be important to you. For example, graduation and retention rates, or how much debt you have. Excuse me, that's, obviously they're using that in the US News and World Report rankings, but they're not weighing it as much. And I think that's really important to know, that no matter what rankings that you look at, that you know what they're using in their evaluation. And so make sure you look at the methodology, no matter what rankings you look at. Next slide. So as we move into questions tonight, I want to set expectations as students go into the application process there. Matt mentioned the University of Alabama is getting 57, 58, 59,000 applications, and they're enrolling a class of about 8,000 every year, and that's exactly what's happening across the country. The number of applications has really greatly increased. The acceptances have gone up, but not as much. But as you can see, the enrollment is basically the same. And so what's happening is that students are applying to more colleges than they used to. So back in 2002, 2003, they might be applying to 4 or 5 colleges, maybe 3 or 4 colleges. Now they're applying to 8, 9, 10, 12 colleges. And where that impacts you is that you could apply to 10 colleges, you could get accepted to 10 colleges, but you can only go to 1. And so every college really wants to know how they're going to yield you. And so sometimes yield plays into their evaluation of you, right? Like, what is the likelihood to enroll? And if you have a low likelihood to enroll, in other words, they think, well, if we accept this person, they're not going to enroll, and so we're not going to, quote unquote, waste an acceptance on them. That sometimes does happen. I've seen it at some colleges and universities. I know that some colleges and universities do that, and they do that because they want to keep their acceptance rate down. They want to look more selective. And so they don't want to accept students they think, or they're almost guaranteed, are not going to necessarily accept that acceptance. And so where this plays into your college search is, if you really want to go to a place, make sure you express interest. And how do you do that? You show up when their admissions officer comes to your high school. You try to take a tour if you can. You follow them on social media. You open and sign up emails that they send you. You really express interest that if accepted, you're going to go there. And finally, before we go into questions, I want to talk a little bit about the college list, because I know we're here at the end of September. I know many of you are putting together your final college list. If you're a senior, if you're a junior or sophomore, you're starting to think about that college list. And every time I talk to students and parents about the college list, I always encourage them to balance it. And what do I mean by balance it? It means that you're going to have a couple of reach schools on there. You're going to have a couple of schools that you know are kind of solid in your neighborhood in terms of your academics. You're going to have a couple of schools that there's no guarantees in life, but that you're pretty sure you're going to get into. And what I always encourage students is to make sure that you love that list, right? Don't just have one school on there that is your dream school and none of the other schools will do, because what you're going to end up with is you may not get into that school and you might get into one of those other schools on the list. And so it's going to be absolutely critical that you kind of love your list. And I want to end on this slide before I turn it back to Huntington. And that is about, well, how do we find schools that many people call like hidden gems, right? How do we know where are those schools that we could round out our list so that we know that it's balanced? And to me, it starts with selectivity, right? I think that many students end up applying to schools that are just too selective, and they might have an admissions rate around 25 or 30 or 35%, And that means that, they're rejecting and denying 70% of students in some cases, or 60% of students. So you want to go to a place where you kind of have a 50-50 chance of, or you want to think about putting those on your list where you have a 50-50 chance. Now, some people conflate selectivity with quality, and they say, well, if we apply to these schools where half of the students get in and half don't, how do we know we're going to graduate from those places, right? And so you do want to look at their graduation and retention rates. This is all data, by the way, you could find on their website. Graduation rates at the most selective colleges are over 90%. Retention rates are over 90%. More of the national averages are in the 80s. So if you have a college that's under 80%, particularly for students like you, there's different graduation retention rates for men and women. There's different graduation rates depending on your major, but you definitely want to ask that. And then finally, that scholarship chart that I showed you earlier, you want to look for places that can give you potentially merit aid. And you definitely want to look on their financial aid websites where you could get merit aid. That's not aid, that's just based on your financial circumstances, where you have to fill out the FAFSA and so forth. And you can find out a lot of this data on these two websites I have listed here, bigfuture.collegeboard.org, which is obviously run by the College Board. The collegescorecard.ed.gov is the college scorecard run by the U.S. Government Department of Education. And what I like about it is it provides you a lot of outcome data on colleges and universities. If you go there, you can see, for example, how much a new graduate of a college that you're considering is earning after graduation, and you could even look at it by major as well. And so with that, I'm going to turn back to Michael. I know we only have a couple of minutes left, but maybe we could take a question or two.
Absolutely. Well, we'll get a few questions in. I did want to just to talk a little bit about Huntington test prep and build off of some of the comments that we've heard from Jeff. Just about the importance of taking the test in a lot of cases, and just how Huntington can help improve those results, right? And I talked a little bit earlier about that personalized experience, getting people in. We want to get you in to do a test, want to see where your strengths and weaknesses are, so that we can develop a game plan really to help build off of build on those weaknesses, to turn them into strengths and really improve those scores. And so it's all about personalization, getting that exam prep plan. And I think we mentioned earlier that you're looking at an increase of 229 points in the SAT and 5.4 points on the ACT. So when you're thinking about just doing that test, even if it's test optional schools that you're applying to, just how that can improve your chance of acceptance. But also, we've talked about this in the past, right? The impact of financial aid could be significant. So there's certainly a lot of factors, and I think it's definitely worth coming in and go to the website, huntingtonhelps.com, and talk to our experts and see what works for you. And that would be my strong suggestion there. And let's dive into a couple of questions, because I know we want to maximize that. I did get a question that came in, Jeff. You've talked in the past about early admission, the benefits behind early admission versus early action. Just talk as briefly as you can, because given the time constraints we have, are there benefits to one or the other, or is there a particular strategy that people should think about as far as that?
Yeah, so I think it's important to know the differences. So early action means you apply early, usually around this time of year, usually by November 1st. You find out early an answer. Now, sometimes that answer might be a deferral to regular, but you're going to find out in January, usually sometimes February, and it's not binding though. So if you get accepted, you can still wait and look at other options. Early decision, same timeline, but if you get accepted, it is binding, meaning you have to enroll if you get accepted. And of course, then there's regular decision. That deadline is usually around January 1st at most places. Now, the thing about early decision for those colleges that offer it, increasingly they're taking a bigger proportion of their class early decision, which means that if you really want to get into a selected place, you may have to apply early to have your best shot. The problem with early decision is you can't then compare financial aid offers. It really puts you, if you have the financial flexibility, you should consider it if you really want to go to a particular place, but don't feel pressured to apply early decision, because there are many spots and many places where you still can get in regular as well as early action.
Great. Let's take one more, and then I'm just going to ask you, Jeff, just to provide a couple of key takeaways for folks. But let me grab another question. Let's see here. We got a whole bunch too. So it's one person was asking about what Ivy League schools are looking for in students. Maybe we can broaden that a little bit and just sort of, in terms of qualifications that schools are looking for. You've touched on it a little bit, but I think it's worth repeating. What are some of those key priorities? And if you can focus on Ivy Leagues, that's great. But I think for other people, not everyone's going to look to go to an Ivy League school, right?
Well, the Ivy League school is going to look at the transcript in a much deeper way, and they're going to look at for students who go beyond the transcript. And what do I mean by that? Take more AP courses, take courses outside of school, perhaps dual enrollment courses or IB courses that are doing undergrad, that are doing research in high school. They're just going to look for students who the high school is essentially not big enough for them, right? That they have expanded outside of that. And obviously, with a test score, they're going to be looking for a very, very high test score. For everyone else, it continues to be that the transcript, and I can't underline and underscore this enough, that the transcript is the most important thing for them, and that the grades, as Matt said, those average GPAs are going to be critically important to them.
Great. And actually, maybe we can squeeze one more in. This was an interesting question, which I don't think we've talked about, but there are some students who, and my sister, I think, did this. You take a year off, right? And so what's the thought on that trend? Does that hurt you, or does that help you? Or is there something you should be doing on that particular year off that you take to help?
Gap years are becoming more common, and really the key for a gap year is not to do nothing. But I have recommended in my books to do 3 critical things in your gap year. One is don't give up on academics. So continue to take a course perhaps online. It's so much easier now to take a course because it keeps your academic muscles going. Second is to do some sort of work or travel experience so that you're actually doing something that is keeping you engaged. And the third thing is to find some sort of mentor or advisor, because the key thing about a gap year is you literally are in the gap between high school and college. You won't have your high school counselor anymore, and you're not going to have any college advisors at that point. So you want an adult in your life who can help and be somebody you could turn to for advice.
Great. So before we close out, I know we're a little bit over, but just a couple of key takeaways. There's been a lot of information.
Yep.
What would you say to parents and students listening in for a couple of key takeaways?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the high school profile that you're trying to leave with, I think the key is, grades and courses are most important. The SAT or ACT test score, I would suggest taking it so you have a score that gives you options. That's something that the colleges are going to be using kind of as a check-in, as Matt said, right? We're going to look a little bit deeper at the transcript depending on the test score. So have that as an option. Make sure that as you're planning your schedule that you're maxing out, especially the more selective colleges you want to go to, that you're maxing out on those courses that you have available to you. So don't try to take the quote unquote easy way out, and have a balanced list, but also have a balanced high school experience. We didn't get to talk a lot about this, but we talked a little bit about activities, as Matt mentioned, what they're looking for in activities. They don't want just the student who's studying all the time and getting a 1500 on the SAT. They also want somebody who's balancing that out with some activities as well.
Good, makes sense. Jeff, thank you so much. Appreciate you as always. And for those of you out there, you can go to Jeff's website, jeffselingo.com, sign up for his newsletter, get his books. He's a best-selling author, and he's done this work for many years, and we're really appreciative for Jeff and his partnership and making the time to join us. We'll get this event published and send out to you in the next day or two. But if you don't see it, just go to huntingtonhelps.com/webinars for this event and for other events that we've done and upcoming events as well. And of course, I do recommend, again, reach out to our team at Huntington, go to huntingtonhelps.com, call our center, and our education specialist can talk with you and find out what the best plan for you is going forward. On behalf of Jeff and Huntington Learning Center, we'll say thank you again so much. This concludes today's event. We look forward to seeing you at our next event in the future. Stay well, everybody.